My name is Lowell Bergman, in case you're in the wrong classroom. This is J260, Investigative Reporting for Print and Television. It's a seminar that has met at this time for over 20 years here at the University of California, Berkeley. Because the symposium started 7 years ago, I figured out that a lot of people would arrive early to enjoy the weather. Well, by the way, we should all praise the weather gods. 7 years in a row, no rain. That I could recruit people who were showing up to teach my class. And this is the extension of that. Starting the symposium this morning at the time that we'd normally be doing class. And I think people are still straggling in, which is a good reflection of the nature of having graduate students who operate on their own time. Today's panel is, to me, when I was looking at it, is a great example of the kind of investigative reporting that's not only that we're all proud of, but also the kind of investigative reporting that seems to be continuing despite the collapse of the commercial model. In fact, I was talking with some people a little earlier, and we were saying that given all the predictions that there would be a dearth of really good reporting in the public interest, in fact, it seems to be more than ever in many ways, and of a deeper quality. And I'm going to introduce someone who's going to lead the panel, who I met a number of years ago, Suzanne Reber, who was then working for CBC Radio and later became the head of the investigative unit at National Public Radio, where she did incredible things that had never happened before at NPR. Many of you may have tried to deal with NPR or a number of other established institutions and try to collaborate and actually get something done. And for the first time in the history of NPR, they opened their doors and they wound up doing a tremendous amount of what became award-winning investigative reporting with a wide variety of groups. And one of the reasons they could do that is that Suzanne has these unusual skills of being able to deal with some of the outsized egos that populate our profession. One of the many mental disorders that we're afflicted with. But before I give up the podium to Suzanne, I wanted to point out that on the panel at the far end is Ed Wong, who is an alum of the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and actually my seminar. Oriana Zill, who I feel like is from 60 Minutes, who in many ways I say is someone who started working for me when she was 11 years old, which is actually true, and continued on until she got a better offer. And then a number of people I haven't met before on the panel who Suzanne's going to introduce us to and talk with about their work. So welcome.
Thank you, Lowell. Well, I was kind of reflecting a little bit on the title of this panel, How the Sausage is Made, and I've actually sat with you guys there, and I was thinking about like, how do I qualify to actually be up here, because I'm not David Boardman or I'm not Lowell Bergman, but actually was born in Switzerland and have sausage-making family on both sides. And it made me think about this whole idea of how the sausage is made, because the whole idea of sausage is that you use everything as you're slaughtering whatever it is. You use everything you have, and the irony about investigative reporting is we usually have nothing when we start. So I thought it would be a great way to engage what is an incredibly esteemed panel. We've got Pulitzer Prize winners, finalists, print, broadcast, everything starting with Michael, who is going to talk to us about his Methadone story that did win a Pulitzer for that. And we have Gary and David, who are super sleuths who tracked down fugitives into Mexico. Oriana, who had to tackle a story with her partner, Michael, who's actually in the audience, basically on a guy that we thought we knew everything about and frankly knew nothing. And we have Eileen, who tracked down the NYPD's new way of tracking the Muslim community, which is essentially to have spies everywhere. And Ed, who works in China for the New York Times, and has to deal with sources, none of whom can ever be named. So I thought, what better kind of way to start the conversation? They tackle just about every kind of aspect of the sleuthing and the detective work that's often involved in doing investigative stuff. So I think we should get right into actually how the sausage is made. We're going to try and focus a lot, not about what the stories were about, because you've all read them and watched them, but sort of how it is that we actually get things done and how we get to the amazing findings that you have. So starting with Michael, maybe Michael, you can talk to us a little bit. You have an incredible process in how you test a story before you even start.
Oh, I think
maybe you could start there.
I think it's just from experience. I think we all have, a gut feeling of what makes a good story, and because I've given enough talks, I've actually put down my 10 points of what makes a project on a piece of paper. But in this case, it always starts with the idea or the tip. And the way this story started was an unsolicited email, which we get anywhere, dozens a day generally. And this was from a doctor in the Seattle area, and this was a 3-page email, and it was the most undecipherable, incomprehensible email that I'd ever received. You read the first paragraph, and it was full of medical jargon. There's no way to understand what this guy was saying. But in the middle of the email, it said, hey, people are unnecessarily dying from taking a pain drug that the state's steering them to. And so for me, the first process of, okay, I've got this tip. This guy says people are dying. I've never heard the methadone being used for pain. I thought it was used for heroin addicts to wean them off, addiction. So really, methadone's become a pain drug, and people are dying from it. How do I test that? So that's on this checklist that I have, it's one of the things. Can the issue be quantified? Is there a way to test this? I don't want to say. Some people say methadone's dangerous. Some people say it's safe. I don't want a story that says he said, she said. My idea of a good investigative story is he said, she said. Now I'm going to tell you which one's telling the truth. And so what I came in is how do I find out how many people are dying from methadone? And this is, and I know there's a panel later today on data-driven journalism. I really recommend that you pay attention to that one, because that's really at the core of a lot of what we do, is how we quantify the issue. So for me, it was getting a death certificate database from the state of Washington, and this is just a list of 40,000 some people every year who die in the state. And I took a look, and I ranked them by what is the primary cause of death, and I found, wow, there are thousands of people who've died from methadone. And so I started looking at it, and I realized there were 2,173 people over the course of the death certificates who had died not only on methadone, but were listed as accidental deaths on methadone. So holy crap, 2,173 people died accidentally on methadone. And so now the question is, well, is methadone really being used for pain, or is there some other reason? So the Drug Enforcement Agency on the web has a database called the Archos Database, and you can download that into your computer. And I can track, the DEA tracks controlled substances from point of manufacture to sale by the gram. So I looked at methadone, and I saw, look how much is being manufactured and where it's going, what states, and it was 100%, 200, 300% increase in methadone consumption in almost every state in the country. So now I realize methadone's on a huge upswing, and two, a bunch of people are dying from it accidentally. Now, why? How are they getting the drug? And that's when we looked at the state of Washington, and this is similar to most states. You find that the state has a council or a state agency that develops an approved drug list for people who are on Medicaid or anyone who's on a government-subsidized program. And the state's role is to find a drug that's cheap but as safe as the more expensive drugs. So you have lots of pain drugs out there like Oxycontin, hydromorphone. Methadone costs less than $1 a dose. Oxycontin costs $12, $13 a dose. So the state says, oh, they're equal in power. Let's put everyone on methadone. What the state wasn't telling people is that methadone is a unique drug. Most pain drugs dissipate from your body within hours, 8 to 10 hours usually. Methadone stays in your body for days. And if you take methadone for 3 or 4 days and your body's going to react badly to it, you've built up a deadly reservoir in your body. And they call it the silent death, because you'll essentially just nod off and go to sleep and die. And this is what we were finding with the 2,173 people. Did you want to keep asking?
Well, I was going to ask you one more thing to follow up.
I'll go on forever.
All right, Michael.
It takes me an hour just to say my
methadone.
name.
I mean, a lot of us have covered methadone in different ways. I mean, there's a kind of a stigma attached this idea of methadone treatment being used for heroin addicts. So how did you bring to life a lot of these people and give them kind of, because it was a completely different application.
This was the toughest part of this story, particularly once you have the numbers, once you have this quantification, how do you bring it to life? And so we took the death certificates and we started cold calling families and saying, we know your loved one died from methadone, could you tell us what's going on? And by virtue of the death certificates, we were able to see whether these were abusers, so to speak. We actually made a custom spreadsheet of the people who died from methadone, how many had illegal substances in their body, how many only had methadone in their body. So we were able to identify the 80% of this population that were true pain patients. The problem is that pain patients are heavily stigmatized, in society. People who take pain drugs are stigmatized, and often the people who require this kind of pain treatment have had really bad, rough times. They've lost their jobs, they've lost their spouses, they've degenerated physically, emotionally. There's all kinds of baggage. So many families that we called said, yes, my son died from methadone overdose. He was taking it for pain after a traffic accident, but we don't want to go public because people make fun of us. They'll think my son was just abusing drugs. Because there's all these prescription drug abuse stories out there, and it's almost like anyone who takes a pain drug, something's wrong with them. You need to suck it up. There's something bad about that. We did find a family. Her name was Angeline Burrell. And what was great about her was that she's like any one of us. She was a 911 dispatcher for the county in Seattle. She had an operation that created a complication, unexplained pain. It took 2 years roughly for the doctors to figure out what was causing this pain. In the meantime, she became so debilitated that she couldn't do her job. She went on pain drugs, more expensive pain drugs, until she lost her insurance, and then she went on Medicaid, and then the state steered her to methadone. 3 days after they upped her methadone overdose, as I said, it built a toxic reservoir. She died. The family did agree to go public, but it was a great internal battle even within that family as to whether to tell her story, because it took years for her to deteriorate, and it was a tough story for this family to acknowledge that their daughter died, this horrible, unnecessary death.
Thanks, Michael. Actually, you did speak to Tom. Thanks. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit to David and Gary from the Chicago Tribune, who I guess more than most journalists actually took this sort of idea of super sleuthing to the nth degree, essentially tracking down felons that I was amazed at reading your story, just how many felons just in northern Illinois you ended up finding had sort of flown the coop. And so I'm interested in just the idea that you essentially became cops. So talk to us a little bit about, is that the classic investigative story?
In some sense, this is the classic investigative story because it looked at a secret world and penetrated it. What the impetus for this story was that Gary had, in the 90s, had an experience where he had been writing about the murder of an infant and found that the alleged killer had fled down to Mexico. That was during the days when the newspaper was flush. Gary went down to Mexico and found Saul Aguado and identified where he was in his story, and Aguado was extradited back to the United States as a result and to face trial. And that kind of experience haunted Gary and raised the same type of question that Mike is asking. How often does this happen? What's the kind of the scope of this problem where somebody would flee justice and go to another country and get away with it? And what we found, and this is where it became a classic investigative story, was that this world is completely secret. Of course, the Marshal Service and the FBI put out colorful wanted posters, but generally they don't tell you how many people have fled the country and where they're believed to be, for the very good reason that law enforcement believes that if the fugitives knew that they were being sought, that they would go further underground and hide. This is so secretive that about 10 years ago, when a California trooper was killed by a gunman who allegedly fled to Mexico, Congress held hearings on that case, and the Justice Department and the State Department would not tell Congress how many fugitives America believed to have fled across the borders, what kind of crimes they committed, and where they had gone. So we were dealing with a completely secret world, and we had to figure out that, and we used at first law enforcement sources. We used an enormous amount of FOIAs and FOIA appeals to various law enforcement agencies who fought us tooth and nail for the information. And we used data scraping techniques, some of them very simple, like figuring out the verbiage used on an international warrant and getting all examples of those international warrants from Nexus and Pacer and other online court sites. But some of them incredibly complex. We read through hundreds or thousands of county court files. We found that there were 200 fugitives that we identified that went to across the border from the Chicago region, thousands more across the country. And because of immigration patterns, those people who'd fled from Chicago, more than half of them went to Mexico. In looking at the files and talking to the victims' families, we discovered that the victims' families often were immigrants themselves and knew where the fugitives had fled and had told law enforcement, and law enforcement had pinpointed an exact place. But this is where we're not cops.
Can I talk a little bit to Gary?
Yeah.
Gary has a long history, obviously, as a foreign correspondent, both South America and Cuba, Africa before that. I'm wondering, you talked a lot about, David, about the technology and the records you pulled, but I noticed that you also used a really tried and tested method of phone books and actually door-to-door sleuthing when you had to go overseas or down to Mexico. So can you talk to us a little bit about just having to go back to doing some really basic shoe leather?
Yeah, I mean, you know, now obviously investigative reporting, a lot of it up here is data-driven and scraping and using all these techniques. But when we got down to Mexico, and I think it's something always to remember is, you know, go back to the very basics. So when we got down to Mexico, you know, we literally, in many cases, when, you know, we think we know, kind of know where a fugitive is, we literally had a photograph that we would walk around on a block and say, do you know this person? Do you know this person? And obviously people were incredibly suspicious. It was not always safe, and we learned lessons very, very quickly about that. But you know, oftentimes we would actually, you know, find the family, and they would deny knowing this person, et cetera, et cetera. There are a couple of specific examples I can give, but I think the point is we used phone books. We went to the post office. We did the basic investigative reporting. We got marriage licenses. We got birth certificates. There's a great example of this guy, Oscar Hernandez. And about 15 years ago, he was accused of gunning down, he was a gang member, accused of gunning down a freshman at Hampton College who was on spring break in Chicago. This gentleman, Armand Browning, was in a car. He crossed gang lines. Oscar saw him, allegedly fired and killed him. And Oscar immediately fled overseas. And we were able to find a UFAP, a federal document saying he had fled to Morelos, Mexico. Well, Morelos is a city and a state. That didn't do us much good, but we found Oscar's family in Chicago. And at this point, we knew that it wasn't like in the movies where people, you know, they flee the country and then they get plastic surgery and they hide under a cave or somewhere. What we really learned early on in this project was they go home. You know, people need a support network to survive. A lot of these individuals may have been born in the U.S., but they're of Mexican or Korean or Indian, other descent. They got to go home. You know, they got to go to where they have family and friends. And so in interviewing Oscar's mother, she told us, hey, I don't know where he is. She was crying, you know, he's fled, he left the country, and I don't know if he's alive or dead. But in this conversation, David and I asked her, you know, just very simple, hey, where are you from in Mexico? And she said, oh, we're from El Estudiante. You get on Google Maps, El Estudiante is a town in the state of Morelos. So we thought, that's where we're going to go. We get down to Morelos, Mexico. We get down to El Estudiante. I'm not going to get into the details, but a woman comes out of Oscar's house. Somebody said, oh, he's living over there across the river. A woman comes out. She's holding the baby. We say, hey, do you know Oscar Hernandez? She says, no. Okay. So what do we do? What do you do? So we sort of walked around, went to the nearest store owner, who was incredibly courageous, you can imagine. For us, we go into this town, we can leave. This guy is living and working right next to Oscar Hernandez. And this guy told us, hey, he is living over there. He says, that was his wife you just talked to. So what do you do then? So we go to the local registro civil, it's called, and we say, hey, do you have marriage certificates, birth records, et cetera, not only of Oscar, but of his wife. We saw she's holding a baby, and of the baby. Okay. Through that, we were able to get the wife's name. We knew the names of the kids, and Oscar Hernandez had signed the birth certificate of the kids only a month or two before, so we knew he was there and he was living there. So that's the idea, you know. First off, you would never assume anything is private or public. In Mexico, we never really learned whether birth records or marriage records, you know, were public or private. You go and you ask for them. And we went in a transparent way. You don't go to a foreign country slinking around. Everything we do is transparent. You know, we had to go to the Registro Civil, and we spent the entire day with that individual saying who we were. Obviously, people in Mexico initially thought we were police officers. You got to be from the FBI. But we went there, we were transparent. We told them about the alleged crime. We said we didn't know if Oscar Hernandez was guilty or innocent because he hadn't been proven guilty or innocent. But through that process, we were able to get the records and then prove Oscar Hernandez was there, and then confront the wife again.
Thanks. So I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit to Oriana, if I can actually see you. Oriana Zill and her partner, Michael Ray, who's in the audience, were the co-producers of The Fall of Lance. And all of us were twittering and talking about that. But I guess what I wanted to talk to you about is, how do you deal with a story that, anyway, a lot of people already thought they knew everything there was to know about him. Everybody suspected he was lying. But talk to us a little bit about how you actually ended up doing this story without a background in sports reporting.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, to be honest with you, when they first came in my office in 2011, and in January of 2011, and said, we want you to work on a story about a cyclist, you know, Lance Armstrong, I was like, who? I mean, I was I mean, of course I knew who Lance Armstrong was, but I was not a sports reporter, and I said that to them, and they said, well, that's exactly why we want you to do this story, because this isn't a sports story. And in the end, it was not a sports story at all. It was a real investigation of the biggest fraud in the history of sport, and or one of them. And I was a member of a team of people who were basically, we had 3 months because our season ends in May, and from February to May, we had to see if we could do the story. We knew that there was a government investigation that had been started, a criminal investigation in Los Angeles, and we knew that one rider, Floyd Landis, had come forward and said, all of this stuff is true, that you've been hearing for years from, you know, wonderful investigative reporters like David Walsh from the Irish Reporter, who works at the Sunday Times. And many books had been written, there had been allegations out there, and we honestly did not know whether the allegations were true when we started doing the story. And that, for me, it was a very classic investigation, because if it was true, it was an enormous fraud, because his entire story of being the cancer hero who had gone on to win 7 Tour de France's was built on a lie, and there was a lot of money involved, and people's lives had been damaged in the process. So we went about doing exactly what you were talking about, which is people and documents, people and documents. So we basically said, if this is true, there are hundreds of people who know about it, and they've kept it secret all these years. So we need to find them. So we made lists of every single person who had ever touched Lance Armstrong's life. We definitely, you know, piggybacked on the brilliant reporting of many other journalists and book writers who had worked on this for years. And, you know, we found people like Betsy Andreu, who was the wife of a rider who had ridden with Armstrong, was very close to Armstrong, and then had gotten screwed over and left, and had sort of had a lot of problems because he had made allegations about Lance. So we went to them, and they were incredibly helpful. One person leads to the next, leads to the next. And Betsy had sort of made it her life's goal to uncover the truth about Lance, because he had called her horrible things, and journalists from across sports media had repeated those things as if they were true. So she was furious at everybody and very, very motivated to uncover this fraud. So she helped me. She literally gave me a list of 25 people to call and their phone numbers. And from there, you know, it went on and on. I mean, we had 5 people. We had 5 people working full-time for 3 months, and that was Michael Radutsky, Tanya Simon, Keith Sharman, Flora Tartakovsky, and me, starting in February 2001. By March of 2001, we were meeting with Tyler Hamilton, who did not want to talk and did not want to go on 60 Minutes, and we had to convince him and work through the process with him of what it would be like to actually tell the truth. He told us that it was true. He laid out the whole story for us off the record. So then we had to go through the process of getting him to agree to go on the record, which was extremely difficult for him. He hadn't even told his mother. So at that point, he basically had to make the decision that he was going to tell everyone in his life that he had been a fraud. And I mean, I'm getting upset just even thinking about it, because he's a very sweet person, and this was extremely difficult for him and every other rider who actually went on the record with us, or the ones who went off the record with us. It was extremely difficult for them because the omerta in the sport was so severe that people were literally trembling when they would talk to us about it on the phone. People were literally terrified of what would happen to them and what would happen to everyone they knew once it was revealed that there had been this massive conspiracy. So, again, it was real shoe leather reporting, calling. We called probably 40 cyclists who had crossed the world of Lance Armstrong. We called maybe 100 other people who were support teams, you know, for Lance, whether it be the masseuse or the, you know, personal assistant or the this person, that person. And we also had several undercover sources who I still to this day can't name, who also helped us to be completely convinced that we were right. So we ran that story in May of 2011 with Tyler Hamilton, and we had probably 4 or 5 other riders confirming everything, but many of them off the record. We also ran a story, we were attacked by Lance Armstrong after that story ran. He sent a letter to executive editor of 60 Minutes, executive producer of 60 Minutes, Jeff Fager, in the middle of the night, sent it to every newspaper in the country, and we didn't get it till 7 a.m. when Fager woke up. By that time, it was already all over every headline that Lance Armstrong demands an apology from CBS News 60 Minutes. And in the public's eye, I think it really did stir doubt, and they didn't believe our story was true. And I remember even my father said to me, "So, what are you going to do? Are you going to apologize?"
So, Ariana, I think you have a clip to play for us, right?
Yeah, and
do you want to
let me
help
just
us set that up?
Yeah, let me set up the clip, because it's it's one little portion of our story which is really investigative, and this was such a high stakes story that we couldn't run this part of the story without people and documents. We had to have documents, and it was extremely difficult because only 5 people had a letter that confirmed that the Swiss lab director, Martial Sagui, had gone publicly, after one of the riders, Floyd Landis, had come forward. He had said, and Lance failed a test in 2001. He failed an EPO test, and it was covered up. Then Tyler Hamilton told us the same thing. Lance failed that test in 2001, and he told us about it. So we had to track down that story, and we ended up finding out that this lab director, Martial Sagui, had gone to the head of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and he had in turn taken him to the FBI and the FDA investigators, and they had interviewed him, and it was on the record, and there was a letter floating around that documented what he had said. And so we determined that we had to get that letter, which we did in fact get. And so that was our second piece in May of 2011. We ran that portion of it, which is Lance, this test. It wasn't a failed test, but it was a suspicious test, which indicated that he had done EPO, which is one of the substances they use. So we knew that story to be true. We had completely traced it down. And what I want to show you is a little bit of what Lance said about that story on the Oprah. And this is our more recent story that was co-produced by Michael Ray and I, which got into, we interviewed the head of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, Travis Tygart, who is a hero in all of this. And he takes issue with some of the things that Lance says.
Explain to me how we've passed so many tests if we're so dirty. And they don't want to answer that question. And that's not fair.
But Tygart did want to answer that question, and he began an investigation. He convinced writers to testify to USADA. He looked at Armstrong's tests from his first Tour de France victory in 1999 and found EPO. Then, a Swiss lab director, Martial Saugy, said that after he got a suspicious test result on Armstrong in 2001, he was directed to meet Armstrong and his coach, Johan Bernil. Saugy said the meeting was set up by the International Cycling Union, which oversees the sport.
He was instructed by UCI to meet with Lance Armstrong and Johan Bernil and explain the EPO testing process, which he told us was unprecedented. And I asked him, did you give Lance Armstrong and Johan Bernil the keys to defeat the EPO test? And he nodded his head, yes.
Tygart believes Armstrong had influence over the UCI.
Lance Armstrong made a generous donation to the International Cycling Union of $100,000. Do you think that was meant to influence them?
I don't know. Obviously totally inappropriate.
Why inappropriate? Lance Armstrong's trying to support anti-doping in sport. That's what he would tell you.
It's an inherent conflict of interest.
I didn't know everybody.
During that interview last week, Armstrong was asked about that 2001 Swiss test.
That story isn't true. There was no positive test. There was no paying off of the lab. There was no secret meeting with the lab director.
The UCI didn't make that go away?
Nope.
He exonerated essentially the UCI, and our information is, and the evidence is different than that.
What was it about what Armstrong said in the interview about UCI that you thought was wrong?
I think their involvement was a lot deeper in him pulling off this heist than he was willing to admit to.
Thanks, Ariana and Michael. Eileen from the Associated Press has been covering counterterrorism and Homeland Security, both at AP and CQ before that. And it's interesting to me that your story, I think your partners on the story approached you because you were kind of the expert on counterterrorism, and yet there are many things that they talked to you about, the police who were sort of using these people called moss crawlers and rakers and terms that it sounds like even you had never heard of. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you guys actually tracked what is essentially a network of spies, and it sounds like a bit of an episode like Homeland, for doing this work and really having to take on a huge apparatus?
Sure. So my colleagues, Matt Apuzzo and Adam Goldman, are on the investigative team, and they had been doing stories about intelligence in the CIA, and every once in a while someone would say, have you heard about the NYPD? And on the other side, on the law enforcement side, the counterterrorism side, for years we've known that the NYPD really built up its intelligence capabilities, and that they had a program that no one else had, but we didn't really know the details. And so as Matt and Adam were doing interviews on other stories, people would say, have you heard about a moss crawler? Have you heard about a raker? And they hadn't heard these terms, and they asked me if I had heard them, and I hadn't. And so then we went back and we found out what they were. And basically the NYPD had created this intelligence division that used undercover officers to rake the coals, which was looking for hotspots in Muslim neighborhoods for suspicious activity. And they used informants to, these are the moss crawlers, they would go and they would take notes on the weekly sermons and report back. And so the Obama administration, and even before in the Bush administration, since 9/11 had made a really big deal about, don't criminalize Muslims because of 9/11. And they have really structured this outreach program for law enforcement, from the FBI, Homeland Security, to local law enforcement on down, how to do outreach with the Muslim community without alienating them. So this was the exact opposite of what I had been hearing from the White House and from all of my sources. And so we started getting a lot more details about this program. And we started asking people, is this okay? You're holding these seminars about how to do this that seems to go against what you're doing. And in Washington, people would just, we'd ask about the NYPD and they'd roll their eyes and make a face, and you think, oh great, we're gonna get something. And then they shut it down, they go, the NYPD does a really great job. So no one was touching them at all. So our first story came out in August of 2011, and it really gave this perfect detail about this spy operation where the NYPD had hired a former top analyst at the CIA, and they helped build this program. And local police were adapting to this new way to focus on counterterrorism, and it's focusing on intelligence, which is collecting information that doesn't always necessarily lead to an arrest. And that story ran, and the NYPD said that it was false, and this unit that we described in the story, they said didn't exist. And then we started getting documents with the name of the unit that didn't exist on top of it, and we posted that online. And from then on, we just really started pouring through the documents and picking apart the details of this program. And it's extensive, it's ongoing. No one has said it's illegal. And the Obama administration still encourages a different type of outreach with the Muslim community, which the NYPD does in part, but this intelligence unit pretty much goes against everything, all of the advice and direction that Washington has given local police departments.
So Eileen, we worked on a story, myself from the CIR reporters, Andy Becker and George Schultz, and also Danny Zwerling from NPR, about the suspicious activity reports at the Mall of America. And I remember all throughout that investigation, always people asking us, like, what are you going to do if there's actually an attack during the time that you're investigating? And there's this kind of like closing of ranks that goes on now whenever you touch anything that has sort of a post 9/11 stamp on it. So how did you guys, as a team, deal with that constant sort of attack, even while you're reporting?
We just kept going after the facts, and we weren't saying that the program was wrong. It was very confusing for me to be seeing the NYPD doing this and covering on a daily basis the exact opposite of the guidance that the White House was giving. So we just kept at it, and we started to, some of the documents that we got, we just poured through them, and I started pulling out some names and looking up these people and seeing that, one guy who was under surveillance and considered, dangerous or suspicious was the subject of a Pulitzer Prize-winning story in the New York Times. So while he was being watched by the NYPD, he was also being, trotted out in public by the New York Times. And so it just didn't make sense. And so we started sitting down with these people and showing them their names in these police files and intelligence reports. And a lot of the people in the mosques were the same people who would stand up with the New York police commissioner and with the mayor and do photo opportunities about, look, we all get along, we need your support, you're the key to preventing another attack on New York. And we showed them, did you know about this? Did you know that your mosque was considered suspicious for these reasons? And a lot of people just laughed at us at first. This is crazy. This doesn't make any sense. That's not even an accurate description of what we do here. This group doesn't worship here. And slowly, I would sit with these people for hours and go through this, and they would laugh it off at first, and by the end of it, they really felt betrayed. It really started to sink in. Wait a second, I thought Mayor Bloomberg was my friend, and what do you do when you see this? How are we supposed to do this? And what the Obama administration had been saying is what you don't want to do is lose the trust of the community. The local police and the community have a really important relationship, and it's built on trust. And if you don't have that trust, then no one's going to call the police when there is an incident, not necessarily terrorism, but for instance, if there is a domestic violence incident, a Muslim woman may not want to call the police because she's afraid that the police will come in and file an intelligence report on what they found in her home. So this is kind of what is at stake, and we just kind of kept pursuing it, and we were criticized, but we don't really dwell too much on that, you know.
You just kept going.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to just quickly turn to Edward Wong, who is the Beijing bureau chief or Beijing correspondent for the New York Times. And it's kind of interesting that a lot of you talked a lot about records and bringing things out in the open through all of those wonderful tools. And I think Edward faces a kind of a different task, which is having to report almost everything through, you know, anonymous sourcing. Talk to us a little bit about just how did you adapt to a world where really nobody goes on the record, and you have to do all your reporting by sort of working through sources?
Right. I think reporting in China is a little bit different than reporting in the U.S. or in many Western countries. It's almost like a mirror image or an Alice in Wonderland version of the type of reporting that my esteemed colleagues here do here in the U.S. and that in China, if someone is willing to go on the record, you're instantly suspicious, and you assume that they actually don't know what they're talking about. Because anyone who, like people who really know something would not be willing to go on the record because of the nature of the system and the authoritarian state and the security apparatus there. So the key is to actually find people who are willing to talk to you, whom you trust, and whom you're not going to bring on the, oftentimes we even sometimes tell them, oh, it's better that we hide more of your identity. Like even if, like we don't say that they're like a member of this ministry or this you know, state-owned enterprise. We just use very vague descriptors for them. And so the specific story that I'm presenting here, I did with a colleague, Jonathan Ansfield, in our Beijing bureau. And this is it's a little bit different than the ones we've heard about earlier in that it wasn't a project. It's part of like a competitive, running story that was taking place in the spring of last year in China. It involves a leader, a Chinese leader, Bo Xilai. And you probably saw some of the headlines last year in that his wife was outed as being involved in a murder case of a British businessman who was a friend of the family. The British businessman had been found dead, Neil Haywood, in a hotel in Chongqing, which is the city, a huge municipality of 30 million people that Bo Xilai ran. And Bo Xilai was slated, he was campaigning to be one of the very top leaders in China while he was running the city. So it's sort of like, people often describe it as like the Chicago of China. But so he had this whole apparatus set up there. And then when this murder case broke out, then he had lots of enemies within the Chinese leadership. So then they all started trying to take him down. And he was detained. His wife was detained. Some of his close associates were rolled up, and they were all put in secret detention. So then at this point, like many news outlets were reporting on it, we wanted to do a story that went a little bit deeper and looked at his inner circle that he had built around himself, both in his years in northeast China and in Chongqing, sort of like looking at sort of like almost like mob-type apparatus that had built up with businessmen next to him. And so there were rumors floating around that he had close ties to certain business people, like a billionaire named Xu Ming, who was named by Forbes at one point as one of the 10 richest men in China. Like he was a multi-billionaire at the age of 30 or in his early 30s. So, so the key was to figure out the relationships between all these people. And we started off in the story because we got a taped, we were given an audio recording, a digital audio recording of a conversation that took place in central China between people who knew about this inner circle. And they had met members of this inner circle. And these were just people sitting in a room talking among themselves, sort of gossiping about what had happened to Bo Xilai and his closest friends. It got into our hands through someone we know. And so I then flew out to Chongqing and started meeting with sources in Chongqing who were part of the state apparatus. Like each of the sources I met with had some role involved, like they were involved with the Communist Party in some way or involved with the Communist Party institution. And so to that degree, I started trusting some of them because they were people within the system. They weren't people outside. They weren't disgruntled people who had left the system and were trying to be whistleblowers. They were still within the system. They had things at stake like their jobs and their reputations. But they were willing to talk about this because Bo had just fallen, and so any implications, like any blowback, would have been minimized at this moment because some of his closest allies have been rolled up in Chongqing. So they were willing to talk about it, if reluctantly. And so I did interviews with them, and they told me about some of the businessmen that Wall had surrounded himself with. They told me about a former military intelligence operative named Yu Junshi, who was the family fixer for the Wall family. And so then from talking to them, I heard these names, which had already been mentioned, this audio tape recording that we had gotten. And then they mentioned some of the business ventures and business interests that these people had gotten involved in Chongqing after Wall came to power. So then it was sort of the portrait we were starting to paint, that we could see the story shaping up as a story about these few people in the inner circle, and also about how they started up these business ventures in Chongqing after Wall came to power, so that he sort of brought in his friends into Chongqing, and they started doing these property deals. Property's the easiest way to make tons of money in China, and every corrupt official or businessman is involved in property, usually in some way, or most officials and business people. So then we wanted to take it a step further, and rather than just print, background interviews of people telling us about these names, we then did something which is hard to do in China, which is try and find a few public records that would then say that tie these people to some of the business ventures that were going on in Chongqing. So, for example, one of the companies we heard about that was investing in Chongqing property was this Golden Investment International that our sources in Chongqing said this billionaire Xu Ming was involved in. So then we went and he said, oh, our source said, I think the company's registered in Hong Kong, which then made it easier, because once we knew that, then we could pull from Hong Kong. Hong Kong is this thing called the Companies Registry, which is actually like a huge boon for investigative journalists, in that it lists these companies, it lists their shareholders, it even lists the passport numbers of the shareholders, like certain information like that. So you could pull up the name of the company, see who the main shareholders were, and then see, and then they had their passport numbers. So we pulled up this Golden Investment International from these records, and we could see that Xu Ming and his brothers and other relatives were all shareholders in this company. So we knew for a fact that Xu Ming was investing in Chongqing through this company.
It sounds like a lot of the stuff that you guys uncovered is sort of like the first big scandal in China where the Western media is treating the Chinese officials the same they would treat officials here. They seem pretty shocked by the fact that you were able to trace their holdings abroad.
Right.
And it seems like it's really the first time that's sort of broken through in that way. And can you talk to us a little bit about the repercussions now for you guys having done that?
Well, I think that there was, after the scandal and after the reporting by the Western press, there was a lot more scrutiny on both Western reporters working in China, but also on how financial information was starting to leak out to Western reporters. So then, for example, in Hong Kong, I know that there have been reports that officials there are considering closing down public access to this company's registry. And but right now, a few months ago, or maybe last month, I think, those discussions are put on hold because partly this registry exists because Hong Kong's a huge financial hub. There's a lot of foreign money coming through Hong Kong. And foreign companies need to access the registry if they want to invest in companies. So if you shut it down, then you're basically closing off a source of capital. Western companies or foreign companies will be less prone to investments in companies in Hong Kong if it's opaque, if it's unclear who runs these companies. But a lot of mainland interests and these elite families want this registry closed off. There was further reporting that was done later in the year by both Bloomberg and my colleague David Barboza, the Shanghai bureau chief of the Times, on certain family members, the very top leaders in China, and they traced some of their assets through public documents that are available in mainland China. And so that was these are some groundbreaking stories because they use public documents, not in Hong Kong or in foreign capitals, but in China itself. And then there's been some move now because of those stories and because of investigations into Chinese companies by short sellers, by sort of people, hedge funds hiring consultants to look into Chinese companies because they want to make bets against these companies. There's been a lot of wariness now of allowing these documents out into the public realm, and they've been tightening up. The Chinese government has been tightening up now on how these documents are made available. So they've been sort of trying to close, there's been pressure to close off access to these records, and there's been increased scrutiny of us as a bureau. Like, we know that there have been hacking attempts aimed at Western media organizations. There's increased phone surveillance. These are just some of the ramifications. And because of, in particular, because of David's story on the Prime Minister, the Times has, like, they're not allowing visas for certain journalists who are applying that we hired into our bureaus, but they're just not letting even new journalists come into China if your news organization presses too hard on some of these issues. So there's definitely been ramifications, negative ramifications from the government and the pressure that they're putting on us.
Thanks, Edward. Actually, you guys have done great because we said that we wanted to give about a half an hour for questions so thanks for walking us through some of the challenges of your investigations. And I think if we can switch gears and kind of invite questions from all of you who are probably dying to find out more, this is giving us enough time to actually engage with you guys on the panel. So I'm wondering, has anybody got a question?
Yeah. My name is Stanhope Gould. I used to work in television, and to illustrate the difference between investigating for the papers and for television, I met a guy who had all of the crash test records of the Ford Mustang and beyond the Ford Mustang. And we wound up doing a story that Indiana grand jury got so PO'd that they indicted Ford officials for reckless homicide because they had known about the defects in these cars. And they were all delivered to me by this one guy that I had met. He didn't steal them, he just copied all the records and the films and dropped it right in my lap. So I don't know what that means, if anything, but it was easy.
Any more questions? Way at the back. Well, it doesn't sound easy to me, what these guys have been doing. I don't know, that's just me. But sometimes you're lucky, right?
Yeah.
I guess the question is, what's the motive for somebody dropping it in your lap? But
He was a hero, a guy named Byron Block, who made a living testifying against the auto companies in suits. And he just Xeroxed all their records.
Right.
That was Brune Arledge asked me, did he steal the record? I said, no, he just copied.
All right, we've got a question right at the back.
Yeah, I'm Scott Shane from the New York Times. I wanted to ask my colleague Ed, you talked about the consequences of your reporting and the Bureau's reporting for, sort of shutting down sources in a way, potentially. I wonder what you know or what you can say about retaliation against any of those sources, what form it takes. I mean, tomorrow I think we're going to be talking about sources for the U.S. press in the U.S., some of whom are being prosecuted by the Obama administration. And there is a little bit of an analogy between working in China with people who don't want to be named, sources don't want to be named, and working on national security stuff in the U.S. With a parallel situation. And there is this quite striking crackdown. I wonder, I would have thought that maybe in China the consequences would be far more dire. But what do you know about that?
We know that if there are sources, like in the last couple years, the Chinese government has gotten a bit more paranoid about. I mean, they've always been paranoid, but it's been ramped up lately because they're very wary of sort of rebellions or widespread rebellions starting in China, like what happened in the Middle East. So they think that Western journalists would help sort of stoke this unrest if it ever happens. So there's been a lot more visits to some of our regular sources, Chinese sources we meet with by security agents of the state. And often they're questioned, they're asked what we tell them, what we're asking about, things like that. I haven't heard recently of a source being detained and put in long-term sort of detention extra-legally because of talking to a Western journalist in the last couple years. I think we've just been a lot more careful about protecting our sources and not using our cell phones if we're contacting sensitive sources, and just try and cover up our footsteps and trying not to use email traffic too much when we're discussing our sources. I know that in the past there have been past examples of sources who have been detained and then maybe even prosecuted under a vague state secrets law and put into prison for anywhere from several years to more than a decade for passing information on to Western journalists. I know that you wrote that story about the I think former intelligence agent who was, and he's being I guess that's a similar problem right now, that there are these laws in the U.S. that can be used. But I think China's much more onerous about it in that. And also their laws are a lot more vague. There's a state secrets law that can be applied to anything. There's never explanation of what exactly, why the information you're passing on is considered a state secret. The state uses it liberally to try and scare people or put them in detention.
Hi, Diana Henriquez with the New York Times. This is a question both for David and Gary and for Eileen. I'm curious about what internal process you used to satisfy yourself, your editors, the people you report to, that you were appropriately addressing the non-trivial security concerns that your stories raised. I mean, you were, in effect, at risk of tipping off fugitives so that they could hide deeper. And what if you were, in fact, disabling important conduits of information that contribute to the Homeland Security? These are not trivial objections to your stories that were raised, and I'm curious about what process you used in-house to address those ethical concerns before those stories ran.
Wow.
Yeah,
great question, David.
Excellent question. I'll just start and let Gary take a stab at this. That question became a center of our editing and our reporting before we went to Mexico. We did take very, very seriously, and the paper took extremely seriously, the responsibility that we would indeed be furthering the injustice if we stumbled around. And we basically worked out in editorial meetings a kind of a menu of options as we went on our reporting. Again, the gist of our reporting was we were writing about a broken law enforcement system, and we needed to bear witness to that fact by encountering these fugitives face-to-face in their home territory, and that raised this question that we would drive them further underground and hurt law enforcement and hurt the process of justice. And so we worked out this range of options that basically had to do with, well, if we see the guy and he's going to take further steps to go underground, do we notify the FBI right away? How do we conference with our editors about that? Is that our responsibility? And then if so, how do we become transparent with readers about what we're doing and what we've done? And readers were very concerned about this too. And I guess, Gary.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult question and one we struggled with. I think the bottom line to us was, once we got down there, we realized many of these fugitives had been gone for 10 or 15 years, and we learned very quickly that nobody was looking for them. So we felt like, it was sort of like the FBI. It wasn't like we were messing up an investigation that was ongoing. There was no investigation. And we were also under a very strict timeline. So when we went down to Mexico on the first trip, we went after 9 fugitives. We located 8 of them. The idea was we were going to have our story in the paper within a matter of a week or two. And the best sort of calculus we could make was, if we felt like the fugitive was immediately dangerous or was going to flee, then we were going to contact federal law enforcement officials. But none of the fugitives we found or located, we felt fit into that category. We also did communicate with local law enforcement in Mexico to ask them whether or not they knew who these fugitives were and whether or not there was an ongoing investigation.
Once we'd located them.
Once we located them. And in every case, they said no. In several cases, they said, we're going to take your information and we're going to begin an investigation. And lo and behold,
4
of them were eventually captured. One just a couple months, just last month. The last one they'd done an investigation, they said, oh, we're going to look into this guy, we're going to try to get him arrested. And 8 or 9 months later, we never heard from the from federal law enforcement officials, lo and behold, he gets arrested like 3 or 4 weeks ago. So that was kind of the calculus we used. But Diana, we were very careful about that. We had a lot of conversations about it because we're not cops. We don't have guns. We don't have badges. We don't want to be in that position. We are journalists to bear witness. That's all we are. And what we were bearing witness to was a broken system.
And we ran into this all the time. And anyone who covers national security knows that the government will always say whatever you're doing is going to jeopardize national security. So that's just the starting point of a conversation. And then, no, but we need to hear and understand why. And so we engage in a lot of conversations with people to try to explain why this would jeopardize national security. And we involve our editors and our editors' bosses. And we do additional reporting, and we take this very seriously. Now, with the NYPD, the unique situation there is you have the local police department, NYPD, their intel division, which operates independently from the federal government, and then you have the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which has FBI. It's run by the FBI, but it has a lot of NYPD detectives and other federal agents from different agencies and all of that. So usually, if a terrorism investigation is legitimate, the JTTF knows about it and is on top of it. So when we were looking through documents and looking at things to post and to write about, the NYPD wouldn't even engage in a conversation with us about why this would jeopardize an investigation. These investigations had been open for years. We didn't see any movement. And so then we were able to talk to other law enforcement officials who did have insight, who weren't necessarily in the intel division, but were working, on the JTTF, and they would say this is not an investigation, or this is not, this was never on our radar, and here's why. And so we had those conversations all the time, and we every time the NYPD raised it, which was all the time, and we didn't dismiss it, we went and we looked at it, and there were some of their intelligence files that did have information about ongoing investigations that maybe weren't, the reason the file was created, but they were still in there. So if we were to publish the document, we would redact that. And we just asked as many people as possible.
What was your protocol if you had come across in your investigation somebody that you thought was a risk and that you had somehow uncovered? What was your protocol for that?
If this was an ongoing investigation and us, mentioning a name would jeopardize it, those were the discussions that we would have. We'll take that particular name out of a police, we'll redact it from a document that we're posting. We're not going to jeopardize an ongoing investigation. But some of what the NYPD Intelligence Division was doing was not considered an ongoing investigation by the JTTF. And we were able to kind of run back channels there that was unique in this particular situation.
Yeah, I'm Bill Gertz with the Washington Times and the Washington Free Beacon. I got two questions, but I'll try to make it quick. One for Eileen. I thought the intelligence series lacked a little context in the sense that the NYPD had uncovered several serious bomb plots, to blow up the tunnels in the UN, and that was the context of their spying operation. The other context was that the FBI didn't like the fact that the NYPD had their own intelligence unit, so there was this rivalry going on. I'd like you to comment on that. And for Edward, I wanted to ask you, the Bo Xilai case was high international drama. It began with the defection of Wang Lijun to the consulate in Chengdu. What's your take on the Wang element of the Bo Xilai case?
Thanks for those questions. So the NYPD takes credit for thwarting some terror plots that just no one can take credit for. And the example that I always use is the Times Square bombing, or attempted bombing. And the only thing that foiled that plot was a poorly created bomb. So that's on the list of the plots that the NYPD was able to thwart through their intelligence operations. And as for the rivalry, I think that we did make that clear in the stories, that there has been this tension between the FBI and the NYPD, and it predates 9/11. the NYPD and the FBI worked really well on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The Intelligence Division was sort of amplified because they felt that they needed more, that they'd been attacked twice by the same people, and they needed to do more. And so there is always that tension, and talking to both sides of it. I mean, I've talked to people in the NYPD who would say, look, we would bring this case to the FBI, to the JTTF, and they would say, we don't want it. And we would say, all right, well, we're going to keep pursuing it. If you're not going to listen to us and you're not going to look at it, so they would continue doing that. And the FBI has their own side of the story, that the NYPD was getting in the way of investigations because the JTTF was working on something, and someone might have been an NYPD informant who was, under investigation by the JTTF, and so they would prefer to work in the JTTF system, which is, all these different law enforcement agencies working to share information and tap into their own expertise. So the tension between the FBI and the NYPD, and I'm sorry if that didn't come across to you in the stories, but it's a pretty big deal.
So a little bit of background for the rest of the audience about this guy Wang Lijun, whom Bill asked about. Wang Lijun was the top cop in Chongqing, and he was an ally of Bo Xilai. And the whole reason why the murder case of this Briton broke out was because Wang Lijun, in February of last year, fled to the U.S. consulate in Chongqing after he had falling out with his boss. He said, oh, my boss's wife killed this British businessman. He told the American officials there that she killed this British businessman, and now I want to, I'm seeking refuge here because I think he's pissed off at me, and I'm telling you this stuff because I'm pissed off at him. And then eventually all that leaked out, first into Chinese internet and then to Western reporters. And that was how the whole case broke open. But I'm not sure exactly what you want me to say about Wang Lijun, but he was a very complicated figure who went and told these things to Americans. And Americans, I know at the time were weighing, what to do with him. There's some debate about whether he directly asked for asylum with the U.S. And eventually he left the consulate of his own accord, and then the police, the state security apparatus in China brought him to Beijing, and then he was later tried for crimes that were connected to the Wall government. But some much darker parts of what he did in Chongqing have emerged through reporting there in the last year, ever since that happened, which is that Bo and Wang Lijun ran this very sophisticated law enforcement apparatus that would roll up their enemies. And they were private business people, they were rival officials, they were rival cops, and they used their control over the security apparatus in Chongqing to imprison these people, and in many cases tortured them. And so only now are those stories coming to light. And I know that during the debate about whether government officials should have given him more refuge, one of the arguments was that, oh, he's not a good guy. He's a very dark figure who it's very clear he was responsible for numerous cases of torture in Chongqing, and now he's sitting in China in a prison somewhere for various reasons. But it'll be interesting to see later on, if there's public records available about the conversations that took place within that consulate. I think we're all curious to see exactly what he told American officials.
Another question.
Hi, my name's Ian Shern. Another question for Ed. You sort of nonchalantly said, oh, and by the way, our computer systems were hacked and our phones were tapped. So I kind of woke up a little bit. So I'm just wondering if you have any pragmatic advice in light of that discovery on how you changed your methodology to protect your work product and, most importantly, your sources.
I think, the Times did this long article a month or so ago about how its computer system, Chinese hackers were trying to penetrate its computer system, not even necessarily our own individual sort of computers in our bureaus, but through the New York servers. And it was the security agency, or the private security company they hired, said it was a unit of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, that was doing this. And so I think, the Times has taken done things in New York to try and bolster the security around the network. In China, for example, if we use Gmail, or in China or elsewhere, we use like sort of the double verification step on our Gmail. Basically the thing we operate assuming is that they can get into our email or listen in on our phones. So we try never to do any sensitive transactions over email or over the telephone. It gets harder in this day and age because before, when the news cycle was slower, you would have time to try and fly around and meet people in person. But nowadays, like, there's a lot of pressure to sort of confirm things very quickly. If it's a big running story like the Boschilai story, like, there's a lot of pressure. So then, how do you confirm something over some sort of electronic system and still stay secure? And there's certain things we might use, like Skype, for example. Supposedly, if the Skype has been downloaded outside of China, then it's supposedly fairly secure. There's a version of Skype that you download within China that apparently is compromised and that the Chinese security apparatus can tap into. So it's just knowing these, different workarounds and trying to use them, but also not relying too much on them. It's still better to meet with people face-to-face and not talk too much over the electronic system.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. Having worked 5 years in Cuba, all your emails I assumed are read, your offices are bugged,
right.
Your phones are bugged, and your employees are informants. I just assumed that.
Right.
So when I read about the hacking and the email hacking, I was like, well, of course.
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised by
Right.
that, and I assume you're taking all the precautions that
Yeah,
I took working in Cuba, but it seems like Cuba is even tighter than
Right.
China. I
Yeah.
assume when you fly out to meet these officials, these guys who want to talk to you, I assume that you're being followed. Don't
Right.
you?
I don't think we're being necessarily followed from. That used to happen a lot more in China, where you would be followed from Beijing all the way to Chongqing or wherever. But nowadays, that doesn't happen. I think partly it's because the Chinese security forces think that they've got electronic monitoring down really pat. So they rely a lot more on electronic monitoring rather than sort of following your human intel or things like that. So there's a disconnect oftentimes between the center and the provinces in that the center won't necessarily send someone to follow you if you're going to the provinces. And if the provinces don't know you've arrived, then they won't necessarily start following you until for example, when you check into a hotel, then if the hotel sees that you have a journalist visa, they're supposed to report you immediately to the local law enforcement. And then you might get a visit from the police or you might not, depending on how sensitive the local officials are to your presence. And so oftentimes you might not even check. You do all your reporting, meet with your people during the day and fly back to Beijing, or you might sleep in your car. I know some journalists don't stay up all night at an internet cafe rather than check into a hotel.
Yeah.
So it's like sort of ways to keep your presence unknown when you reach the locality.
Yeah, extremely.
But how do you actually locate a source that's in a foreign city or a different city? You can't exactly put out a red flower pot or some kind of device. How do you do that without electronic communication?
In that case, sometimes you do have to. You don't say why you're meeting them. You just say, oh yeah, I heard, a friend told me get in touch with you. And they'll know that, they'll know if they're getting a contact from foreigner. They'll know maybe why they're supposed to meet with you. They'll know that they've got information. If they're willing to at least talk with you or divulge it, then they'll just meet with you. You'll set up a meeting somewhere. And like I was saying, there is still this huge disconnect between the localities in Beijing. So if you're there and they haven't set up the monitoring yet of your phone in that area, then they're not necessarily following you.
Right. Way at the back.
Matt Goldberg with NBC Bay Area. A question about workload. Considering that great investigative stories need time and resources. I'm curious if you would share with us how long you worked on each of these projects, how many people, other resources that you used.
Yeah, Michael, I guess.
Well, that's a tough question. Probably not a fair one for us in the sense that we have a unit within the newspaper that does long-term reporting. So the Methadone story started with just myself for about 5 months, and then when we realized how big it was that we wanted to get it done, we brought in a second reporter. So from beginning to end, it was probably a 9-month process.
The Fugitive Project was started by Gary and I. We brought in an intern, paid intern, to do some of the PACER work we were doing for about a month. We ultimately collaborated with ICIJ, and through a grant from the Driehaus Foundation that we arranged, $10,000, that put boots on the ground in India and South Korea. The entire project took 6 months, is that right?
Well, for the initial series.
From start to the first publication, and then we followed it for...
Yeah, 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, there were a lot of follow-up stories.
We, I feel, are very lucky that our Jeff Fager and Bill Owens, our executive editor, really support investigative reporting. So oftentimes we'll get assigned to a story with a team of up to 5 people, sometimes 6 producers. Some of them are associate producers, so they're not as senior, but they are all usually people who do investigative reporting. In this case, it was 4 producers at the beginning for a 4-month period when our first stories ran. Then we continued, I and Michael Radutsky and several others continued to follow the story as it developed over a 2-year period. And then Michael Ray and I, 2 producers plus Michael Radutsky, produced 2 more pieces this January.
But you were working on other projects as well at that point?
And we were the whole time working on other projects. Michael and I produced probably 2 or 3 stories in that time period. So, but it, you know, we were very lucky to have the resources that we needed, plus the money to fly around and meet with people face to face, which makes all the difference.
And just, we were in a similar situation. We had, I think one of the most important things is to have the support of your bosses and for them to say that this is a priority. Now, 2 of us on the 4-person team were on the investigative team, so they weren't necessarily tethered to a daily beat. But in my case, which I was, we all work for the same editor, so he could look at it and say, no, we're going to pass on this diverted flight, you know, and this TSA screw up, and we're just going to keep focusing on this story. And then there are other things that, you know, we couldn't pass on. I needed to be taken off it for a couple days to work on another story, and then I'd jump back in. So I would say that Matt and Adam probably started working on it full time in the summer of 2011. Our first story ran in August, and I got involved kind of full-time reporting from August on, and I mean, we were still not at the pace that we were, but there will still, I think I did a story in January, but it was almost nonstop through April of last year.
Our situation is a little bit different because, as I said, we weren't working on a specific project, or at least in covering the Boss Eli scandal, it wasn't a specific project. It was a very competitive running story. So the key was to do what you do on beat coverage, which is cover daily developments, but also break out these enterprise or semi-investigative or investigative stories as you're doing the dailies. And that meant, you know, sometimes you would use information given to you by sources to write a daily on it, and sometimes you would keep it, you'll squirrel it away for like deeper looks that would eventually turn to longer stories. And the entire coverage of that, sort of that big news event, took up the entire first half of last year. And we had many dailies as well as enterprise stories on that. And then starting from the second half of last year, then we transitioned to covering the incoming leaders that were coming into China, and so there was less coverage of this particular scandal. And then the other big story that the Times did in the second half of last year related to China was the family finances and assets of Wen Jiabao, which my colleague David will talk more about tomorrow. And that took him a very long time to do.
I think there's one last question at the back from Stephen.
Yes, Stephen Stock, NBC Bay Area. Oriana and everybody, but I wanted to start with you. I wanted you to talk about the pragmatic way you deal with fallout when you attack a sacred cow like this, especially in today's economic environment. There are some here who are freelancers or work for much smaller organizations than NBC or 60 Minutes or the New York Times. You guys came under intense scrutiny and attack. Even your dad said, is it really true? How do you deal with it post that? Because I know when my piece, I think I've nailed it, and then I think afterwards, ooh, did I miss that nuance? Did I miss that fact? Did I not tell the entire story? I'm always self-doubting. So how do you deal with that internally, especially when you attack someone who was so popular and who, you know, this was a narrative that he never did any of this. He tested positive, and you broke that down. How do you deal with that post-airing?
Well, we had to deal with that very quickly. In the May 2011 stories, the 2 stories that ran, we, as I said, received a letter from Armstrong's team immediately asking for an apology and claiming that our entire story was not true. We Fager issued a statement saying we stand by our story and we will not apologize. And we also outlined some of the mistakes they had made in their letter, you know, pointing to the factual inaccuracies in their letter about our story, just to show that, you know, to try to get through to the audience, the daily news reporters that were covering this feverishly, that they were wrong about a lot of things. But I think overall, we were in discussion with Lance Armstrong for months as we were preparing the story to try to get him to come on camera. So throughout this whole period of the last 2 years, we have been in discussion with Armstrong himself to try to get him to come on 60 Minutes and to confront him with the reporting that we had done. We were very honest and open with him and his team about what we had, but we did refuse to tell him the names of the people who were going to go on because we felt that he would trash them in the media prior to the airing of our story. So we thought long and hard about how to deal with that. But I mean, just an example, one time we were talking to Armstrong on the phone, and the guy is such a convincing liar that after the phone call, I went back to my office and reread all my notes because I was so nervous that maybe we're wrong, you know, and I do that a lot, you know, second guessing and just trying to always be very careful about the reporting, making sure everyone we're talking to doesn't have some ulterior motive. But in this case, I felt that, we had more people telling us the truth about Armstrong than I've had on any other story I've ever worked on. We had more sources confirming the story than, and we needed it because this was such a huge public figure. But I was sure. So it made it a lot easier to deal with the blowback because we were very, very secure in our reporting. And we had 5 people checking it. So I think in general, when you don't have a big organization, my advice would be to definitely contact the people that you're reporting on before you air the story, because if they know what's coming, they're less likely to sue you. And that's, you know, Lowell taught me that years ago, that, you know, always be talking to the other side the whole time and communicating and be as honest as possible with them about the story.
Michael, you took on the medical establishment and essentially the state government. So what was there blowback for you guys?
There was, and I think, you know, every story we're facing blowback increasingly. And we look at it as a giant chess game, and we anticipate the other side's moves. You know, what are they likely to criticize us for? So one of the things you'll see increasingly, I think, with all of our stories is we post a lot of documents now with the stories, almost like footnotes. Hey, don't trust me. Take a look at the original source document, and you can see. And so every story I've done, the last 3 or 4 projects, I've had people put out press releases on me. I actually had a guy put up a website questioning whether I was taking payoffs from the people that I was reporting on because my lifestyle appeared to be higher than what I should be. I've never quite understood what that was supposed to be. But, you know, we face this, and I think what you just said, and Lowell's advice, you know, we go to the opposition, so to speak. We don't even call them opposition, but, you know, to the other side, and we vet this story very carefully. Yeah. We spend a lot of time vetting, and I think that's really the key. When I report on a story, what I promise every side is there'll be no surprises in the story for you. You're not going to pick up the paper and see something that I haven't already told you. And that really goes a long way. So if you're going to fight those battles, you fight them before publication. And I guess that's my advice. Fight them out ahead of time. You know, don't be, you know, it's uncomfortable to tell the state of Washington, hey, you know, this Dr. Jeff Thompson, who I admire a lot, we're going to say that you tried to hide the fact that methadone was killing people. I like you a lot, but here's the transcript of the meeting where you were doing this. And there was a lot of blowback. After our story, some of the doctors went to other media outlets, one in New York, and tried to get them to do a story about how bad our story was. I know Eileen's faced this with her story. of the blowback of people who tried to attack the messenger, not the message necessarily. And so I think the way you do that is you present your evidence, you let people decide for themselves as much as possible, and you play, again, the chess game, anticipate where am I vulnerable, and then you work to shore that up.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, life doesn't end when sources stop talking to you because they're upset with what you wrote. I mean, that's going to happen. And there were people that I had spoken to for years who basically just cut me off. And I continued to report. You find other ways. You find other sources. You don't just quit and say, well, now what, since they're not talking to me anymore. I mean, you need to be willing to take these risks, and there's always other people to talk to.
I think it's, Steve, and also, one thing I've learned over the years is that counter-narrative that you have in your anxious back of your brain, it helps to write it out. It helps to sit down and say, okay, the New York Police Department is doing everything it can to thwart terrorism, and they've taken all these steps, and they've saved lives, and write out the counter-narrative, because you'll be able to work that into the story you ultimately write.
Well, I think on that note, we are going to thank all of you guys for taking the time.
Announcements before you break up. First of all, I have to say, and sitting there reflecting on what you were saying, we have a recent story we're working on right now where there's a fugitive warrant out for somebody who's fled to Mexico, and we found him because he's on Facebook.
Whoa, we found someone on Facebook too.
Okay, so before you break up, we have, at 2 o'clock, we have T. Christian Miller talking about scraping. You should come back for that if you don't know what it is. I didn't know what it was until he told me. And then after that, I think we have one of the more important panels, which is the next generation of investigative reporters, who are primarily veterans of the fellowship program here at UC Berkeley. And that'll follow right after T's thing. Meanwhile, the thing that journalists love most is happening next, which is free food, which there will be sausages served in the courtyard, in lieu of a panel, in the courtyard of the journalism school. Thank you, guys.